Welcome to this Bystander podcast. After a long pause, I'm truly delighted to return with someone I deeply admire and have learned a great deal over the years. Today, I'm honored to be in conversation with Dr. Tathagat Varma. He's someone who consistently underplays his achievements, yet his impact across technology, leadership, and strategic thinking speaks for itself. This conversation is just not the journey, but also about the philosophy, the lessons behind your success and thinking that shaped you as the person. My intention is, as always, to inspire people by sharing stories which we can relate to. So, Dr. Tathagat Varma, it is a real pleasure to have you on this podcast. Welcome.
Thanks, Raghav. And likewise, pleasure is always to catch up with you and to talk to you. And I really look forward to our podcast today.
Great. Now, I just wanted to know a little bit about your childhood. Like, what was your, where did you study, about your parents, whatever you can think you can share, that will be awesome.
No, sure. That's a good way to start. So I was born into a family of teachers, and my father was a nuclear physicist. And over a period of time, he shifted from nuclear physics to electronics. In fact, growing up in 70s, I remember he was doing his PhD in nuclear physics. Somewhere around late 70s or so, he shifted to electronics, and then in the mid 80s he shifted to computer science. He opened the computer science department in Udaipur in Rajasthan, where we grew up. So that's been my journey. My grandfather was an academic himself. He was a professor of Sanskrit and Hindi. So I grew up in a family where there was a lot of focus on education. All my aunts, my father, everybody was into teaching one way or the other. And true to the middle class values of those days, we were all very focused on education as the primary variable that we could control. And the expectation was that we should all pursue our career and learn as many things as we can as we go along. So that was the kind of a family environment. My mother was a homemaker. She was a postgraduate in sociology, and then when I was in 12th grade, she actually, I believe if it was in 12th grade when I was there, she did her another postgraduate certificate in information sciences. Though she was a homemaker, she chose to be a homemaker. And it was just me and my brother, 2 years younger. He also grew into software field, so both of us ended up being in software. So that was kind of a starting point, Raghav.
Okay. So doing a PhD was not doing a PhD was not an option. Like,
Oh
looks
no,
like.
absolutely. The family joke used to be that in our family, if you were only a master's degree holder, you were the least qualified. And we keep teasing my son, who is only a BS undergrad. So I keep teasing him that, hey, you are like the least educated person in the family.
Interesting. And how was you as you growing up? Like, whether your parents were very strict or they were like open? Like, how was that?
Yeah, that's a good question. So my father was a physicist, and I think the one thing I learned was he favored discipline. I mean, we grew up with a lot of old school middle class values. So I still remember some of the things he would say. For example, his favorite sayings were first deserve then desire, for example, which was
Very good.
like, okay, it's okay for you to be wanting something, but then not before you have earned it. You have to earn the right to want something. Or another favorite of his used to be better wear out than rust out. I don't know the origin of
Wow.
those ones, but that's something he very strongly believed in, that like it's okay for you to like wear out completely, but you have to give your best, or prepare for the best and hope, prepare for the worst and hope for the best. That was another one of his.
Wow.
So those were the kind of value system he believed in, I mean, in line with the environment those days. He expected a good amount of discipline from us. I wasn't the disciplined type of a guy. So definitely I grew up to actually wanting to be more independent over a period of time. And that's something that has defined me as a person over a period of time. in the kind of choices I have made, in the kind of roles I have taken, and so on. I really value autonomy and independence and creative freedom more than compliance or just following somebody's norms.
Awesome. And as you were growing up, were there any favorite subjects or something which you naturally inclined towards?
So my father had some very interesting ways of teaching us. In fact, it might sound a little odd to you. Our family dinners were very unlike any family dinner. So I remember one summer, my father, he installed a blackboard in our dining room,
Okay.
and he told we brothers that, hey, you can ask any question and we'll discuss that over the dinner. So unlike most family dinners, who would typically talk about things, we would talk about things in the natural world around physics, so planets
Wow.
or meteoroids or those kind of things, right? And that was a very nice thing because it generated a lot of curiosity among us. And it also gave us a sense of a lot of things that we didn't know, a lot of things that were like way above our grade school, because we would ask. I mean, that was also the time I remember it. I was in sixth or seventh grade, and I found a meteorite somewhere,
Okay.
and I didn't know. I just found it out of curiosity, and it looked like a very heavy metal piece, unusually heavy, in the middle of nowhere on actually a cocoa field, the cocoa
Oh,
game that was there, and right. And you know how when kids we are playing cocoa, there used to be duty for kids to actually go and make sure that there are no stones left in that because
yeah,
people are
correct.
falling all the time. So if there are stones or pebbles, they will get hurt. So I was doing that job in the school, cleaning it up, and I found some metal piece which I found out of curiosity, and I kept it with me. And then when I was home, I showed it to my father, and he also felt it was like strongly magnetic,
Hmm.
and we couldn't figure out. It didn't appear to be like a molten piece of metal in the middle of nowhere. So there was a solar observatory in Udaipur, which was a very interesting one. It still is. It's in the middle of a lake actually, and it was one of the
Hmm.
very rare locations um, because apparently the water around it actually reduces the amount of thermal radiation and you get more clear readings compared to an observatory that may be on the ground because there is a lot of heat emission and radiation coming back from the ground, from the surface, right, as opposed to the water. So he, because they were all in the field and he knew the director of that lab, so he basically shared it with him. And then he, after some time, he came back and said, hey, this is a meteorite, and let me explain you how did we come to that conclusion. And they showed us how they had basically like sawed off one part of that. And when it is coming in the molten state, there fine capillaries are made and they still remain when after it is. So there was a lot of those new kind of things that I was learning because of all that. And we would often talk about some of those things. So you can imagine the kind of dinner conversations that used to be there. It was all about like ask anything sort of a thing. Today we may call it as AMA or something, but that's how it was. And so that allowed me to actually pique my natural curiosity. I also remember I had made my chemistry lab in my house that time. It was seventh or eighth grade. And I used to do experiments and those kind of a things. Thankfully, I didn't blow up the house anytime. Though
Nice.
once I do remember that I almost burned down the house because I was playing around with incense stick, the agarbattis, and so on. But generally, it was an environment where he advocated and he supported free thinking, curiosity, observation, ask any questions around the world around us. So that is how my upbringing was, which actually, when I look back, I wasn't a very studious kid. I would barely manage to get like 65, 67% most of the time right through my
Mhm.
school. And in fact, I didn't make it to any engineering college. And I was like mortally scared of biology. So I never tried to even think of medicine. Um, but through the school, it really gave me a meta system of really saying more than the subject, how do you really develop a mindset of observation? How do you really observe? In fact, I remember we used to go walking to the school. And as I told you, we grew up in Rajasthan in Udaipur, which was at the foothills of Aravalli Mountains, and
Yeah.
Aravalli are the oldest mountain ranges in the world. and very free. And we would typically walk up 2 or 3 hillocks to get to the school right from the first grade and then back. And every day it was a natural exploration. We would see water puddles, we would see ponds that would like fill up during the rains. We would see tadpoles, we would catch them, we would have fish and frog. Uh, we would even find a lot of we used to jokingly call them as fossils, but these were like the natural stones that had a vein like structures on that. And I remember we used to basically create the fossils, right? We would bring a mud and create a mud brick out of it and leave a leaf on that and let it dry in the sun and do that. So while growing up, my fondest memories really are of of growing up in an environment that supported free thinking without judging, without really saying that, hey, this is out of syllabus, you shouldn't be studying it, why are you doing it? None of that kind of a thing. So I didn't really fall in love with any subject, math or science or anything. But I think I would, if I have to reflect back, I fell in love with the whole idea of observing things that were not just visible, but like how do you really go behind what is not visible and see what is happening there. Second, applying a lens to it and say, why is it like that? And trying to ask the questions, trying to discover some more things about it. But that's where it stayed. I wasn't really a inventor or something. I really was more in terms of, hey, what is it and why is it like that? So that's the kind of a meta system that I was able to build upon myself when I reflect on your question.
Very nice, very nice. Lot to like process in what you shared. One quick thought I have, like you mentioned about you're not like your grades were like around 60, 65. Did your parents were okay with that? That is one part. Second is because nowadays there's so much emphasis on this grades, right? Because in luckily, my parents also never forced me on grades. So sometimes I feel if they forced, maybe I'd have scored more and all that. But the positive side is that left me still curious about learning and all that. So that is the positive aspect of since they're not forced me, I have interest in any subject. How is that for you? Like, or maybe you can share your own personal view about grades. Like, at that time, did you feel it was not enough or you did not care? How was that?
Yeah, so in fact, they never forced me. Nobody ever asked me the question why I was getting only 65, 67% and not 77 or 87%. There was never any pressure of that kind. There was an expectation. I would not say it was not there. Probably the expectation was more societal than familial because as my father was in university, I grew up on a campus, engineering college campus, where everybody's sons and daughters would either go and do medicine or they would do engineering, and the expectation was always that, hey, you would also do one of those, right? I mean, and literally in growing up in late 70s and early 80s, there were literally no other professions. Yeah, there were other professions like becoming an accountant or going into a legal profession, but those were not something that were in the horizon for people in the academic environment. And everybody expected that is the best world. I guess this is what happens, that children choose the profession their parents are in, kind of a thing, because that's the only thing they know for most part. And that was the pre-internet, even pre-Doordarshan era. So the
Yeah.
options, so the avenues for learning about what is happening other than your parents' field were very limited. So it wasn't easy to always get to know what was really happening. So that is how I would see that. There was no pressure on anything. If you really wanted to push yourself, absolutely, everybody was there to support it. Like they supported me to get coaching and getting some tuition and those kind of a things. But I guess I wasn't really clear about what I wanted to do. I was kind of all over the place and nowhere. So that was my school journey.
Okay. Good, good, good. Antarctica journey also, because that is really fascinating. When I first time saw your TED talk and the way you shared, I could not believe that someone I know has been there. Um, Maybe you can touch upon that like little bit more.
Yeah, yeah.
What made you
So
to
let,
go
let me
and
just yeah, let me just talk a little about the schooling just because
yeah.
it connects to my Antarctica also. So as I was telling, I wasn't really into grades or so, and I did not make it to the engineering college, and I went into doing a good old BSc, which, I'll be very honest, isn't really a great choice. In fact, nobody except for the people who really want to pursue the sciences, I believe nobody goes into a BSc out of sheer joy. And it was like, what do you do after that? There was nothing really to be done. Now, what happened during that time was India was going through the computerization. I'm talking of 86, 87, 88 time frame. And that was a time when we had a lot of IT and software started to come into India thanks to Rajiv Gandhi's time. He brought in a lot of computerization in railways and banks and everything else. We saw the birth of CDAC, Center for Development of Advanced Computing. We saw the birth of CDOT, which was for the telematics. And then what happened was that the defense ministry people also said, hey, we would also like to have something because we need to also grow our computer scientists. And that's how the Masters in Computer Science was started in 7 universities all over India. And starting from one in each state, from Kerala, Tamil Nadu, Karnataka, Andhra, Maharashtra, Indore in MP, and Prayagraj in UP. So I got into that by some stroke of luck. I mean, I obviously cracked the entrance exam, but I got into that course in 89 when computer science was virtually unknown in India. And there were only about, I think, 5 or 6 MTech or so programs in IITs probably, but nobody else was really doing computer science. I mean, I knew about it because my father had started computer science in Udaipur and then later in MP where we were. So he was running BSc computer science. So I had obviously heard of that. I had played with the original Macintosh back in early
Oh,
80s in his lab. We grew up with having punch cards in our house, the used and discarded punch cards for our toys or notepads and that kind of a thing. So computers wasn't an alien subject, but I got into that. And that was a course that was sponsored by DRDO. You may be familiar, Defense Research and Development Organization, and they gave us scholarship, and they gave the university a lot of grants. And then after 2 years, we had a bond with them for 5 years, and they said, "Hey, all you have to do is you get your first class results, and then after that, we will take you as a computer scientist." So that was like the best thing that could have happened back in 89, 90 time frame, because computer science was, as it is, a very unknown field, very emerging kind of a thing. And to be starting the career at such a prestigious organization, DRDO, as a computer scientist was a dream come true. So in 91, I started working in DRDO. I joined a lab in Pune, R&D engineers. DRDO has about 50 odd labs all over India, and they specialize in different areas. So I was in one of them in Pune, and that lab actually was a member of the Antarctic program, the Indian Antarctic program. So Indian Antarctic program had been around since 83, and in fact, our prime minister at that time, Indira Gandhi, she pioneered the whole executive decision making when the first expedition was sailed off. I remember reading about it when even the scientists who had actually boarded the ship, they didn't know where they were going. There was such level of secrecy apparently. That is how India started the program. When I went in 93, 10 years after that, obviously we had a station, we had a permanent station, Mithare. That was the second station. And I basically volunteered to be part of that expedition. And we would typically sail from Goa in November. And the ship had to go in November because it would be summertime in the southern hemisphere. And the ship had to come back before the winter kicks in because, as you know, the sea expands, the water expands and freezing. So if anything is left in that freezing waters, it would just get trapped and the ships will get totally marooned in that basically. So the ships would typically come back by March or April, and some people would stay over for the winter part of that, and they would wait for 12 more months and come back the following year. So I said, hey, I am young right now. I want to see the world. I want to really find out what is happening. It was the same trait of really what started in my childhood days of, hey, what is this? How do people live? What is this whole place? I had heard of ozone hole. The ozone hole had been discovered over Antarctica, as people know, right? And there was this whole curiosity about, well, how does it feel like to really live in a minus 30, minus 40 centigrade environment? It's like you have 90% of the potable water, which is frozen in the form of a polar ice sheet. How do you really live in an environment where you have 2 months or 3 months of darkness at a stretch? So there were a lot of those things which were such a ideal opportunity for somebody to satiate their curiosity that I could not say no to it, and I volunteered for it. And that was the start of my Antarctic journey when I sailed from Goa in November '93.
And your parents and family, they're okay for you to go there? Because definitely I think it's not an easy journey and also not safe also, right?
Yeah, so that's an interesting question. It is by and large obviously safe. Otherwise, it would be. There is
Hmm.
an element of uncertainty, and
Yeah.
I would also admit that there have been accidental deaths in the Indian team as well.
Hmm.
A few years before us, there were three. I think they were geologists, if I'm not mistaken, and one naval officer, and they were all basically they had gone for the sample collection in the mountains, and after that, they basically died of carbon monoxide poisoning inside a tent.
Hmm.
So there was an unfortunate incident few years before I had gone. But my parents were pretty cool about it. I mean, it wasn't really seen as a very, very risky kind of an endeavor as
Correct.
long as
Yeah.
one followed some basics of how do you survive in like those kind of climates. Um, Luckily, I didn't have to take permission from them because, well, I just told them and they were supportive of that. So yeah, that's how it was, and it was primarily my decision. I was 23 something, so at that age, I guess all of us have a rebel streak that we want to make our own decisions
Yeah.
and not really seeking the permission.
Nice. Good. I'm sure that whole experience might have shaped your rest of your life, right? Like how you see things. Before we go there, maybe we can because some of the audience may not know about this. Maybe I'll share the link to the TED talk that is beautiful,
Okay.
where you have shared in more detail. Let's
Yes.
run through that journey a little bit. It's really interesting. When so many times, if I hear also, I still want to hear that once again.
Yeah, yeah. So as I said, I was selected to the 90 to the 1992 expedition, which was 12th Indian expedition to Antarctica. But there was a fire incident there, so we lost a lot of generators and everything else. So they wanted to basically have a specialist in the team who was a specialist from the electromechanical side. So I had to step aside, and then 93 is when I again volunteered. So first of all, obviously you have to volunteer because the way I like to put it, nobody in their senses would like to go and spend 16 months in Antarctica, right?
Right.
It is not for a glory, it is not for money, it is not for fame. Though obviously it's almost like 30 years back, 93 is when I went. At that time, I think less than maybe 300 or 400 Indians had probably done the wintering over. And wintering over is what we used to call as spending the 16 months component. So you spend the entire wintering there as opposed to doing the summer expedition. So obviously there were literally handful of people in the country who had been there. But then the charm, the challenge, the opportunity was really your decision to make. For me, I was the youngest in the team. I was the youngest Indian scientist, and I was excited to really be on part of the 13th expedition that we were on. It was the 13th Indian expedition to Antarctica, and the winter component was the 11th expedition. Yeah, I
Okay.
think because the wintering started not in the first expedition but after 2 years, because the wintering requires you to build a station and you so that you can
Okay.
have like you're able to live in those kind of conditions. Otherwise, summer is you just go and come back kind of a thing.
Right.
So that was a obviously it has shaped my life in many ways. For example, I'll give some instances of that just to illustrate the learnings from there. So one is obviously um, while it is safe generally, as I said, there is a danger, there is a risk every
Yes.
time. In fact, we were 13th expedition, and whether one believes in 13 being unlucky, we had so many close brushes with literally death-defying moments. We had the first night we moved in, we had a fire in the station. In fact, the whole station would have gone up in flames. We were fighting the fire for like 3, 4 hours, and we literally exhausted all the fire extinguishers for the whole year. So we had no other fire extinguisher. Should there be a fire, we would probably have nothing left, and that is how we had to do. Prior to that, we were having helicopters from Navy, and we had two accidents in which in one of them we lost the engine for one of the choppers, and in the other one we lost the rotor blades of one of the choppers, and they actually literally had to do an open heart surgery and basically replace the bad engine with the good engine just so that they could fly it, and which is not something that they would do, because for a search and rescue cover you need to have two helicopters, because what if one helicopter goes down in the icy waters? If somebody goes down in that, you probably have 2 to 3 minutes before the hypothermia sets in, and you get into the risk of like literally getting into a very critical stage. So these were those all kind of things happening. I personally had once I had a very nasty fall. We would typically, so you would have seen those 53-foot long ISO trailers, right? The big trailers. You do either you have cold storage or you have the storage inside it. That's how we basically transport things, right? And we use the same kind of a things, and that was on a trailer. And basically I had to, we were using it with some kind of a like a lift arm had to be done, so I had to put those the lift rope inside that, and so somebody had to go up all the way, so it was almost like all put together almost coming to 20 feet. So I was on the top of it and I was trying to put the rope in that, the steel rope actually,
Yeah.
and I slipped from there, so I literally fell from 30 feet on my back, and I fell on a rock hard ice. In fact, that ice is known as blue ice, and the reason why we call it as blue ice is because it is there for millions of years, and it is so massively compacted part of the polar ice sheet that it actually looks blue in the sunlight. You can take an ice axe and you can try everything, but you won't be able to even break it. It is like so hard. Now imagine if I fell on that one on my back, anything could have happened. My back could have broken. I was actually winded out. That's the first time I understood what does being winded out really meant, because for almost maybe 15, 20 seconds, it looked like many minutes or maybe hours. There was no air, it was all thrown out from my lungs, and I was gasping for air, and I didn't know what's going to happen. Will I survive, or have I hurt my backbone, because I fell on my backbone. Luckily, because of all the multiple layers of clothing that we would do, like 3, 4 layers of clothing, I think it absorbed all the shock. And because I've been a little chubby on side, so I think the body fat probably naturally protected me. I was thankful to come out of it with just some minor bruises. But there were occasions like that where we all probably came close to getting seriously hurt, if not dying there. So obviously you have to learn to respect the nature. That's the first thing. The nature, you are like tiny speck of dust in front of the mighty Mother Nature, and I think that's that whole sense of like proportion comes very alive to you. Like uh, the man does not really think very high of nature, and the man goes and plundering the bounties of nature. But I think when we go and you realize that in such a pristine environment of Antarctica, 90% of the world's pure drinking water is there. It is actually a thermal shock absorber, because if if the global warming were to happen, and if the ice were to melt, I think a lot of coastal cities would drown because of all the water that would flow into the oceans. So, and then the whole ozone hole that was discovered, I think by and now after 30 years people are beginning to see that it's healing, but those days it was a big deal, and we had meteorologists who would launch the balloons and do the observations and those kind of things. I saw there was a Russian station nearby, and Soviet Union was breaking apart those days, and suddenly they were like literally out of funds, and I saw how the human values became so prominent, especially when I saw people were their net worth or their money or whatever paper currencies were just reduced to collector's item. That's all. There was no value for that. People were coming literally so that they could save some money, for example. And then I saw how East Germany and West Germany were uniting at that time, and suddenly the German government did not have enough money to support the so many stations. So they started packing up some of those stations. So I saw how internationally some of the very big events that were happening in rest of the world, they were also unfolding in a remote place like Antarctica. But the biggest learning was that the human values were very strong. We had so many good times and such a nice friends with the Russians. I used to joke I had more friends in St. Petersburg than anywhere else in India, actually, thanks to my expedition there. And obviously, with the kind of uncertainty and with the kind of dangers lurking around everywhere, you have to you have to team up. You cannot do things by yourself. You have to learn to trust your instincts. You have to learn to respect the nature, and you have to build a team so that you can do it together, because no one man can really do it all, especially there. So that was something that really gave me a very good sense of what does it really mean to be a part of the team. And the team was a really like a Lagan team in many sense, right? There were people who were basically literally the soldiers from army, who were diesel mechanics, or somebody was a truck mechanic. They were not highly educated, but they knew their subject very well. And then there were scientists. I was a scientist as well, and there were scientists, PhDs and all. There were doctors. So there was a very wide variance of the educational qualifications and the capacity to understand different things by different people. But everybody was expert in their own area. People from meteorology department knew their subject. People from geology knew their subject that nobody else knew. And the best way to make a team or to make friends was to really listen to what they had to say. So that was a important thing. But I would call out two other things and then I'll pause. I think the one thing it really taught me very well was that, because especially in a place like that, you had to keep your morale high. You are kind of inside a big boss environment. You cannot go away. You may not like your neighbor, you may not like your next door guy, but you still have to live out the entire 16 months of your expedition. And we would have situations once in a while. There would be people having arguments, one or two fights, for example, because it has an impact. The whole loneliness, the whole isolation, the whole being away from the families, it can really play on minds. And then some other physics events, cosmic events that would happen. So for example, whenever there is a solar flare, the solar flare would actually there would be a huge influx of neutrons in the environment because of that. And those neutrons, for some reason, would be near the magnetic poles. So there would be a lot of chitter chatter happening during the solar flares. And it would render the whole satellite communication like no, to not happen at all. And interestingly, that also had an impact on humans. I don't know the medical science behind it, but people would go crazy and they would get very cranky. There would be people who would not sleep for 2 3 days. There would be people who are very irritable. And right now you are in the middle of the winters and all, right? And then you have 2 months of darkness. It's only half the expedition that is over. Nobody can go back. People are having their families back in the mainland. They are having their all kind of problems. That has an impact on you. They have limited ways to connect with the family. We would only get 6 months of telephone time every month. And if the families are having any problem, the only thing you could do was cry alone in your room, but you would not be able to do anything else, right? So when you look at the total context of that, as a person, you have to really develop the right kind of an empathy to understand other people's point of view. First of all, being equal does not mean having the equal educational qualification or having the same kind of a white collar job. Being equal means being equal human beings. That's about it. No ifs and buts around it. And that really was something that I learned. And the last thing I would say was the whole humility and respect for people goes to a totally new dimension. And I've talked about that in my TED talk also. We all had to do different duties there. So we ran the whole station like a ship. And on the ship, you typically have galley, which is the kitchen and the whole cooking area and eating area and so on. So we had this so-called galley duty that was basically a 24-hour duty by two people. It would start at 7 in the morning and go on till next day 7 in the morning, so that other team will take over. And during that time, you typically would start helping the chef of the team to lay the breakfast on the table, then go and clean up the vessels, the cooking vessels, the plates, everyone washed their own. So that discipline was already there, but the cooking vessels we would clean up the common areas of the station, the lobby. We used to call the lobby as chopal. So that's like the Indian term, right? The like the village kind of a square sort of a thing. But the most interesting, and I would even say, I won't call it as demeaning, but I would call it as the most, what should I say, humbling experience was that you had to go and basically do the toilet duty. And toilet, actually, we had to literally burn everything in an incinerator, and we had to collect the ashes, and we had to pack the ashes and bring it, because you cannot pollute Antarctica. So now imagine we are trying to go into those sub-zero temperatures. Sometimes it's -20, -30. You are going under the toilets, and you are basically like literally firing it up, because you have to burn up the whole thing. And any amount of ego if you have about yourself, any amount of arrogance if you have about yourself, everything comes down to the mother ground, because there's no way you can really feel, and it's so humbling that you have to basically do the toilet cleaning duty for all the 25 people of your station. You have to clean up all those five toilets. You have to burn that. Sometimes it doesn't burn. You have to go out in the cold and again tinker around with the fuel supply, and then go, and once it cools down, you have to collect the ashes and do that. I've done it so many times. After doing it, you do not have any ego left in any about anything. If anything, you only have a lot of respect for every kind of a function, every kind of a job. No job is below us, whether it is cleaning things, whether it is sweeping the floor, whether it is burning the incinerator waste toilets or collecting the ashes. You ashes come all over you. You cannot feel yucky about the whole thing. You just have to take it in your stride and do that. So I think, to me personally, that is something which has had a lot of change and impact on me, because even though I was the youngest, I didn't have a lot of airs about it. But it gives you a very balanced perspective in life, that there are so many people around us that make the life successful, and not all of them may appear to have a very, what should I say, a very sexy job around them that makes you good, but they help you shine. And we have to be respectful towards that. We cannot just take it for granted and say, oh no, this job is less important, I can afford to ignore it, and so on. So I think that, to me, how do you really respect people for human being for what they do, as opposed to saying that this job is higher, this job is lower, kind of a thing. I think those were some of the biggest learnings that continue to guide me even today. And obviously, they've had the most impact on me in shaping my personality and how I look at things around me.
Very good, very beautiful. In fact, especially the last part, what you shared about no job is below us, like I think very important in this scenario because right now I'm seeing many people are out of job, lot of job losses are happening, and sometimes even I went through a long period of out of job. And sometimes it hits us like to take on some job which may not be below my designation and all that, right? Maybe I think this experience what you shared kind of opens up, like if person is really looking for a job, or maybe it's just to start something, because there is no job is good or bad or
Correct,
better
correct.
or
It's
less
it's
better,
only
right?
it's only our attitude towards it that makes us think whether it is good or bad. But I think anything that's a decent job that makes you do something, add value to others, is ethical, is moral, is legal, I don't think anyone should really feel bad about doing it, because a job is more than just a paycheck. And I think it's becoming more important in today's era, as we are seeing how the technology is going to upend a lot of jobs like AI and everything else. I think the biggest thing people need to understand is that a job is more than a paycheck. It is the identity of people. It is how they are seen by others. It is how, unfortunately, the society judges us. And it is also, unfortunately, how we sometimes judge ourselves. And yes, sometimes we may be harsh on ourselves and say, hey, I'm capable of doing much more than this. But I think the reality is that a job is something that really makes us in this world. And I think we should absolutely, and everyone has circumstances, like you said. I think in a 40-year career, all of us are almost guaranteed to go through lean patches. I don't think there is any two ways about it. What will really help us is having a healthy respect for the fact that people go through different times, and having an empathy for people when we see, and having a maturity to understand that it can happen to me tomorrow. Like, nobody is immune about it. I've seen n number of cases of people at all levels in a corporate hierarchy who thought they were immune to these kind of a things, and things have happened where unfortunately it was not in their control, and they had to go through those kind of phases. But yes, your value system is tested during that time. And I think the only thing I always tell people is that hopefully when you come out of it, you come out stronger and more mature to understand that even others working with you can have it. Treat them with respect, and if you see somebody who is going through a difficult time, do whatever you can to help them. You connect them with people who may be able to open the doors for them, offer them any guidance that you can. Like, I do it all the time. I try and help people as much as I can to the best of my capacity. If I know places where they might be fitting very well, I try and connect with them. But I think the way I look at it is, all of us should have that sense of gratitude and a sense of responsibility to be of service to others.
Very nice, very nice. I have some more question just to complete this Antarctica thing. Before you
Yes.
went, was there any kind of training or some preparation given? Like what kind of preparation was that?
So there were two kind of things. One is, obviously, we had to go through a tough medical and psychological exam,
Okay.
because medical is required, as you can imagine, that while we had two doctors, one surgeon from army and one more doctor, they can only do so much, right? If
Mhm.
somebody has very serious chronic ailments, then they would not, like, you don't want to create an emergency in Antarctica
Yeah.
because somebody has to go through a bypass surgery or something like that. So those obviously would be a no-no for such a long period of time. And then psychological was important, because more than the physical, it is actually a psychological expedition. Because, in fact, a lot of times outside the temperature would be minus 20, I think the least we saw was some minus 35, with a wind chill of, with a wind of 70 miles an hour. So the effective was minus 70 or something because of the wind chill effect. And then snow blizzard, where I put my hand in front of my face, and I cannot see my hand because the snow is like blowing across 50, 60 knots kind of a thing. So there were all kind of a things. And then you have 16 months of isolation away from the mainland, from your family. You have 2 months of total darkness. It plays on your mind. Obviously, people get cranky and people become irritable and so on. If you are not psychologically strong to handle that kind of a extended stay, you would not only become, you would not only likely to go into a depression. Or, in fact, depression was not a term back in the days, in
Yeah.
30 years back when we were doing, but I think the psychologist had some other term for judging it. But who was likely to get into a depression, or who was likely to get into bouts of demotivation, or even develop suicidal tendencies. So those were the kind of things I guess they were looking for. We went through a rigorous psychological evaluation, which they actually followed up once we landed back after 16 months also. I was told I was probably among the happiest one there. So I think it stayed, the both before and after readings were pretty high for me. And then we had to also go through some kind of a acclimatization. Now, as
Hmm.
a part of the acclimatization, we had to learn how to survive in a cold climate kind of a thing. We went and stayed on a glacier up in the up above in Uttaranchal, basically in Oli actually. There is a mountaineering and skiing institute in Oli near Joshimath, and that's where we went and stayed. We went and pitched our tents and stayed near a glacier. We learned a little bit of like rappelling and some other things. In retrospective, those were not the kind of things we needed, but I think for most of us who had never seen snow in our life, that was the first time we saw ice and snow. It gave a sense of how do you use your snow gear or ice gear, and how do you protect yourself in cold climate, and so on and so forth. But nothing can prepare you for staying in Antarctica for 16 months. You have to be there and you have to learn from the nature. But some of them were helpful to actually give us a little bit of a preparation as to what you are signing up for. But I can safely say that the isolation, the kind of challenges, the kind of learnings, the kind of loneliness, I think there was no amount of prep work that would prepare you for it.
But did you had any kind of practices or some anything which helped you to, because that loneliness I'm sure was very severe, right? So how did you manage that personally?
So luckily for me, it wasn't that much of an issue. I was single. I was the youngest in the team. I didn't have to worry about my family back in India. I knew there were other expeditioners who had a family, they had parents. My parents were hale and hearty. I didn't have to worry about them. But in many cases, people who were elder to me, they had parents in some place, they had family in another place, and the family was dealing with the same day in and day out issues. I mean, somebody not getting a gas cylinder, somebody had to pay for the school fee, somebody had some other problems. They were going through all kind of problems. For me, luckily, I had no such things to worry about. And we actually, there were four of us, one naval officer who was my galley buddy, and then there was an army major, Atul, great friend. Unfortunately, passed away a few years back. We had our army surgeon, Colonel Das. We used to call him as Dada. And then we had another AIMS doctor, Arun. So we were like four or five of us who found that we had common interests, we had common thinking, and the most of all, we loved playing bridge. So we formed a bridge foursome, and then we would like play bridge every evening, because you have to have some discipline of like, you have to have some common interest, you have to have some activity happening together. Otherwise, you are likely to just go into a negative spiral and like you don't know what to do after that. I loved reading. My job was to do some experiments with the communications. I used to be in touch with my colleagues in Pune. We were doing HF radio based communication. I was also the postmaster of the Mithare post office, so I would do a lot of creative things like creating the special first day covers and so on and so forth. But essentially, you had to be creative and you had to find a lot of activities, social activities, to really embed yourself into the rest of the team. Otherwise, you were likely to like not have too much of interest, and then that was really the dangerous part, because then it would go into a kind of a predictable domino fall, because you
Yeah.
are isolated, you don't have enough friends company, you don't have any activity, the weather plays on you, you kind of go into a very negative death spiral sort of a thing. So that was one big thing. And I saw some people in our expedition were not really very social, so they would limit themselves and they had a very small circle, and they were not always probably in the best of spirits. So yeah, I think, and I can relate it to the our corporate work, right? A lot of times our projects are running late. You don't have clarity on that. You don't have too much of, sometimes funding is not there, sometimes the company is going through a bad times and so on, and people tend to then go into a negative thought cycle. But I think it's even more important during that time to understand that if people are going through it, they are not doing it by choice, but they are doing because they have no choice, because they are victims. So I think as a manager, as a leader, it gave me in the future, like after when I got into managerial and leadership roles, it gave me that necessary grounding to understand that if somebody is going through a difficult time, it is not that they are trying to be difficult, but they are themselves a victim. And as a manager, as a leader, I was able to develop the empathy that treat people with due respect if they are going through those kind of a things, because well, we all go through that, right? Things are not in our control. So that's how I've been able to process that and kind of bring it back into my life. And like I said, it continues to guide me even today.
Awesome. Maybe I think just to kind of, I want to highlight that part. What you said is if somebody is going through a problem, not to see that person as a problem, but having that empathy, because since you had that experience and a background, you could relate to them and support them. I think that is something shaped your leadership style, right? That was a good point. Good point to look at.
Sure.
I'm sure I think those kind of incidents might have also given you that kind of resilience to absorb later shocks in life also. In fact, I was thinking today morning, sometimes maybe you also mentioned that because of your age and that time, right, when you don't have to worry about your parents also, and also you don't have like a family to worry about. Maybe at that young age, I was thinking about whether I should put my daughter into some kind of a simulated hardship so that at least she becomes stronger and comes stronger and all that. But I think that's a good period to. I think we should experiment, right? When you're young, just go get into some challenge.
Yeah,
So
yeah, no, totally agree with you, Raghav. And I've spoken about it, and I've shared that in my suggestion is that, so my thinking was, if I was a computer scientist and I was in software field already, I had no business to be on the Antarctic expedition ship, because well, software is probably only 10-20% of what I did. We were doing an expert system for diesel generators, so I was part of the team. We developed the expert system, and we were doing the HF based radio communication, data communication, and all. So obviously we were doing something from my field. But I would say that probably 70-80% of the learnings were totally outside my field. And my reasoning was like this: two things. One is, I think we have to learn from all the things. We just should not limit our learning to our field alone. And that is something that continues even till date. Like, I read a lot of books. I read about 100 books a year, and they are from all over, right? They are from history to civilization to microbiology to biomimicry, complex systems. I like to learn. I may not understand all of them. I don't claim that I understand, but I try to pick up whatever I can. So that was the one big thing that came out of my experiences. So that I think has continued to obviously shape that. And the second thing was that, hey, software is something I'm going to do for the rest of my life. If I like, because that was my specialization. How many of us really get a chance to do something that is like totally disconnected to software? It has no remote resemblance to software. And who knows, maybe that will shape up who I am in the future. Now obviously that's a risk. You may decide to step away from the field, step away from the treadmill, and it's possible that after 1.5 years you are so out of touch with the field. I was literally out of touch, right? There was no internet, obviously. We actually installed internet in 94 in the Indian station, and we got the email and all that back in the days. But there is a risk that by the time you come back, the technology has grown so much that you've been living under the rock for 16 months, and you come back and you are unemployable in the market. Now that risk is always there. But how many times do we get the opportunity in our career to go and sign up for an experience that's going to radically challenge our mental models, that's going to shake up our thinking about the world, and that's going to open up to a world which we have no idea how it's going to be in the future? And my answer to all of these was, I would do it every single time, because that is how I saw the whole learning. Learning is not in your comfort zone. In fact, I believe that the learning happens only when you are away from the comfort zone. That is when your mental models are being tested. That is when your own brain is really being wrecked by, hey, what is this? How do I process it? What is the meaning of all these things? How do you make sense out of the whole thing there? If I would not have signed up for Antarctic expedition, I was happily sitting in my job in Pune. I had great friends. We used to play badminton every evening. We had fun time. I would have continued. I had no reason to really throw myself out of the comfort zone. But it's been 35 years since I literally went, and I don't think that I would have really gotten even 1% of those life lessons by continuing to be there. So yes, there was a risk. There was a risk of obsolescence in the field that, hey, once I come back, I don't know whether I would have. I mean, I never thought of really leaving my job at that time. Later on, I realized that the industry had picked up and I moved to Bangalore in 95. But at that time, the thought was not even there because in 93, the industry was non existent, literally. Um, and of course, there was a one in a million chance that you may not come back alive, but then that is fine. I mean, it's like that is the amount of risk, residual risk that is there in everywhere, right? Whether it is air travel, whether it is probably going on a highway or anywhere. So we live with those residual risks all the time. So there was nothing special about signing up for Antarctica. But professional obsolescence was obviously a risk. Like, what are you going to do with that? How do you even justify it on a resume, and how do you explain it to a recruiter what you were doing in Antarctica and how does it relate to your professional experience? But over the years, I have found that it didn't really matter. Um, and maybe that will be a connection to my PhD journey. But what I found was that Antarctic experience was very similar to my PhD journey. None of them have helped me in getting a job, have helped me in any promotion, but they have shaped my thinking, they have shaped my thought process, they have given me the tools to think about a problem. How do you deal with ambiguity? How do you deal with uncertainty? How do you deal with being like miles outside your comfort zone and still make sense out of that situation, size up the problem, develop your own thinking system so that you can analyze it and you can design a solution and come out of it with some clarity out of it. And I think that to me is most important. So I would absolutely agree with you, the idea that I think all of us at every age, and especially at a young age, should sign up for something that really pushes us outside the comfort zone. Maybe take a world tour, go away for 3 months in Himalayas and live there like a monk, or do something which really is something that you never thought. In fact, the more distant it is, the more unconnected to your field. You should always be asking the question, and it's like, what am I doing here, kind of a thing. Because if you're not asking the question, it is in your comfort zone. It is very well aligned to it. It is just like another semester of college, right? Because if it's from the same field, then you're not really learning anything. You may intern at another company, but you are still within your own, drinking from the same well, unless you really go to another place and say, "Hey, I'm going to drink from this well." And by the way, there is no well. The well has to be dug first because you have to deal with that. And only then you are going to do. I think that to me is really it really prepares you for a lot of ambiguities and uncertainties. And yeah, you don't have any fear after that because you can handle yourself in any situation. And you respect people when they come back and say, I failed. Because failure, there's no failure in that, right? In fact, the only failure is not doing it. But the failure is not there, because even to think of it and to sign up for it and to take the first steps outside your comfort zone itself is an act of courage, if not an act of rebellion. And I respect that thought process.
Awesome. Very nice. Very nice. As you're growing up, what were your role models and what you used to spend time on helped you to grow?
Yeah, so actually, I did not really have any role models per se while
Mhm.
growing up. I mean, even now, I don't have too many role models. What I do is I like some things that some people do, and I get inspired by that. But I don't really consider somebody at that pedestal and say, hey, these are the role models. Like, somebody may be great in innovation, and I would look up to them and say, hey, that is innovation, or that is grit, or that is humility. But I kind of pick and choose those. And part of the reason was also because I wasn't really a big reader of the books as well during the school time. In fact, so my father was more into sciences, as I told earlier, right? Physics and other ones. So there were all kind of books in the house, but they were all of physics. And the good or bad of being born into an educational academic family is that your views are basically influenced by the kind of books they have. There are a lot of books, right? Hundreds of books were there, but they were all on physics and nuclear physics and other things. And my father wasn't much of a, what should I say? He was more into the hard sciences, the physics, which was the queen of sciences and so on, but not so much on, let's say, people or sociology or
Mhm.
anthropology and some of the human and social sciences kind of a thing. So as a result, I would say that my education during the school days was incomplete because I never got a chance to appreciate the human side of sciences. I was able to understand those days. I even I still remember actually. I mean, like I read about fuel cells while I was in seventh or eighth grade, and I like when I hear of fuel cells even now, it's been like what 45 years or so, and even now that dream is not realized. My father would those days in early 80s or so, he would come and talk about things like in the future we will have digital screens that will be rollable like a newspaper and you can cut and create it, and he would talk of futuristic things those days
Wow.
which we are beginning to see now, right? So obviously there was physics was leading to a lot of technology and development those days. And my father was a tinkerer. We made a solar cooker at home, and we were big users of solar cooker and those kind of a things all the time. But on the human and social sides of things, I had like zero knowledge. I had no idea about understanding the human behavior. And because my father was very strongly into the sciences, there was this whole element of causality, right? As we say
Mhm.
in science, because there is all you never have anything happening with it was like Newton's first law. There is always a second law. I'm not sure which one it is, but you always have a reaction to an action, which means if something is happening, there has to be a cause behind it, right? So you
Mhm.
cannot have something which has no cause or rhyme or reason. Whereas human beings are not as if like for example this famous book, right? Dale Carnegie's book on how to make friends,
Yeah.
where he said that human beings are not creatures of logic, but human beings are creatures of emotion. And I think
Mhm.
that subtle distinction is very important because while growing up, I learned the whole aspect of logic and science and causality and everything else. But I really failed to miss because I didn't read any books during those days
Mhm.
which exposed me to the human side of human beings, which is like how are we human beings really creatures of emotion? And that I don't carry it as a regret, but that was something that
But
I try to make up now. I try
how
to
did
read a
you
lot of those.
how did you move towards that? Like, because now meant also the way you manage, I think I'm sure you read as well as you observed and learned a lot. How did that shift? Like any particular incidents which created that curiosity in you on that aspect?
I think, like I said earlier, some of that came from my Antarctica expedition
Okay.
because when I saw people, there was no logic to something. I mean, we had one guy, I would not name him. We had one guy who was like very much missing his family. He would just get drunk in the middle of night, and we had a orchestra set, a drum set. He would go, it used to be on the loft, so there was like a
Mhm.
big loft that was connected above our cabins, and the drum set was kept on the loft at the far end of it, and he would go and like go all the way up at like 2 in the night to 3 in the night and then play that because he had to get it out of his system.
Yeah.
And all the whole station, the whole team would have to like get up, and then we are wondering, okay, what is happening, because we are awake till 4 in the morning. And like, and sometimes people would get angry at that guy because like, hey, why are you spoiling our sleep? This guy was under stress because of his other challenges from the family side of things. He even had a drinking problem, so that augmented, like aggravated the whole thing. So I had so much of opportunity because in 16 months you see a lot of things happening. The players are the same. There is no change in the membership of the team. You cannot solve the problem by just talking alone. And nobody can walk away from the station to live somewhere else. So you have to live with the problem. You have to live with victims. You have to live with the people. So you have, and everybody's processing in their own ways. Some people are processing and saying, "Oh, this guy is just a troublemaker." Somebody is processing and saying, "Oh, this guy doesn't is not mature enough to handle his." And we were all men. So I'm just using the term man and his because of that. And somebody is saying, oh, this guy doesn't, he cannot handle this kind of a thing. You should be mature enough. This guy was from army, and his officer would say, would expect that, oh, you should be mature enough. You are posted at the border, and are you going to do like this on a border post, and so on and so forth. But I think somewhere there was this whole human element that was not fully understood, not fully explored. And at least in my own understanding, in my own analysis of that, I learned how human beings behave differently, which I didn't have obviously any theoretical foundations to that. I only had empirical observations to that. So then I started to learn more about the human behavior, why people behave the way they behave, the theories of motivation, why they work, why they don't work, how do we inspire people. And I think it came very handy because in our industry, in software industry, people are the essence of competitive strength, but people are also the source of all the challenges, right? Because and most of the time we software people do not understand this. We have never been taught sociology. How many of the software people have gone and taken courses in sociology or psychology, or how many of them have their toolkit that involves tools like ethnographic tools to really understand what people are going through in the trenches, or do they understand these qualitative methods, for example? So I then went in 2008. Actually, in 2003. Actually, I signed up for HR course. So I went to an executive MBA in human resources. Even though my background was computer science, I realized that I don't know enough about human behavior. And that actually led me. I never wanted to move over and become an HR executive, but I found that when I went through the whole organization behavior theories, the OB1, OB2, OB3, as they call it, right? The whole individual, teams, and organization. I went through the theories of motivation. What motivates people? You have theory X, theory Y, and you have a bunch of other things there, and Maslow's theory of hierarchy and so on. It opened up a very new world to me because it gave me access to the frameworks, the theoretical foundations, and the tools to put some shape to the whole thing. Because my learning until that time was very abstract and all over the place. I had learned from my practical experiences that people behave like this, people behave like this, but I was not able to describe it in a structure. So I went through these learnings to basically build that structural foundations underneath my observations, and then I was in a position to really understand and do better. So that's how I would look at your question, Raghav.
Very good. That is good. And just connect the dots, I think after Antarctica, you moved to Bangalore, right? Like you moved to Bangalore
Yeah, so
and
after Antarctica, I came back in 95 to India, and 94 was actually a very interesting time for Indian IT industry because, for example, IBM came back to India with Tata's. So they came back as TISL. And that was a kind of a defining moment because until that time, there were not too many multinationals. So I found in 95, the scene was very different from 93. There were about 15, 20 multinationals from US and Europe that had come, and they had started to open their small teams primarily in Bangalore. Today we call them as GCCs. Many people don't realize that the global capability centers or the GCCs started springing up in early 90s. And so I moved to Bangalore. I joined the German telecom giant of those days, Siemens Telecommunications, that later on was merged with Nokia and is Nokia now. So I worked with them. Then I worked with Philips for about 4 years. And those were the time then we started seeing a lot of the European and US companies setting up their product centers. We started building on them. Then I was part of another team that was setting up the Indian operations for Huawei, the Chinese telecom giant, and we set up the Huawei operations in India. We built the whole product culture over there. I got a chance to live in China for a year in 2002. That was another interesting learning in cross-cultural understanding because when language is not common and cultural context is not shared, people again have a very different way of looking at things, and nothing could have prepared me again for my 1 year as a leader in the I was leading a large team of 200 engineers. I think roughly about 100 and 130, 140 were Indians and about 50 were Chinese. And the Chinese engineers did not speak English. And there was always a integration challenge in terms of how do we really bring everyone on the same page. And so I took it as a learning opportunity and say, how do we really create the right kind of shared context so that people feel more connected rather than seeing themselves as just part of the team and going home after that. And then I moved from 2003 onwards. I have been working with US based, primarily Bay Area based companies, which opened me to yet another perspective, which is like very innovation driven culture and obviously very fast paced kind of an environment in terms of how innovation eats itself kind of a circle. So those have been opportunities for me to really learn from various cultures. I got good opportunities, thankfully, to learn from Europeans, from Chinese, and from the American companies by and the national cultures as well by working on them.
Right. And just to ask, like, if there is a young leader or young manager who is taken up a new roles, right? Uh, what kind of an advice you will give because of your vast experience and also cross-cultural experience, right? Um, what is your thought on leadership? Like, what the young leader should consider himself or herself when they're managing, say, diverse group of people?
So, and I'll use the reference for tech, but it may be applicable to others also
Yeah.
because I'm familiar with tech. So I will give that example. I think the first thing is I would say is most of the tech managers come from the engineering side. So, and I think this problem is more rampant in India than other places. But the first thing I learned was don't stop being a technical engineer just because you are a manager now. That's really the first thing that I tell people. It's very glamorous to be seen because especially in our society in India, we are a very status conscious society. And right, everyone likes to say, I'm a manager, I'm a senior manager, I'm a director, and so on. I've literally had people come into my team and said, I want when I'm getting promoted to manager, because if I don't get become a manager, all my friends have become manager in these companies, and nobody, I won't get married, and so on and so forth, because there's so much of societal pressure on them, family pressure, societal pressure. But what happens is that being a manager in India is not a full-time job. It's a double job basically because you, in many cases, you are dealing with people's emotions even more than that. And it's very difficult, very hard to explain to people, especially in the West, because for the major part, you expect, and a lot of times rightfully so, the engineer in the Western country is very self-managed. They are very self-aware of who they are and what they bring to the table. You never have to follow up most of the time. People, when they give the commitment, they are very honest about it. They say yes is yes, no is no, and there is no gray area in between. And when they say that it will be done in 5 days, by and large, you can count on that as commitment written, just being short of written in blood kind of a thing. Now, come to India, you have a very different situation. Most of the time, yes is never yes and no is never no, right? I mean, we never say no actually at all. Even if we have to say no, we don't say no at all. We say, let me try or I'll do it. So the whole commitment management becomes a very tricky part of it, first of all. Secondly, a lot of times that self-managed, self-awareness kind of a thing is not there. And I won't say that it's a bad thing. It's just a learning. All of us with the right inputs and the right guidance and the right coaching can acquire it. We just need, as a manager, if you are aware of the fact that people are not living up to their commitment, not because they are sleeping on the job, but they are actually still learning. And you have been given a raw diamond in your hands, and your job is to essentially polish it. That's how I would see the role of the managers in India. So if you have not yourself really polished yourself, a lot of times what I have seen is a pattern is very clear. There is a smart engineer, somebody who has really been super sharp, and he or she gets promoted to the manager. And I remember back in the days, we used to have a joke that when you make your best tech engineer as a manager, you lose two people in the company because you lose your great engineer who is not doing engineering anymore, and you make somebody as a manager who was never meant to be a manager, who was never fit to be a manager in the first place, but because you had to give a sense of meritocracy, or you had to create that semblance of, hey, we reward good work, and we promote you to manager, but that individual's heart is not there. That person cannot think like a manager. That person is still an IC, individual contributor. Now it is much less. Back in the days, it used to be much more, because there was a glass ceiling. If you had to grow beyond it, you could only go up to a tech lead level, and after that, what do you do? So if you don't
Right.
become a manager, there is no future for you. So
Yeah.
I mean, we were all guilty as charged back in the days because of the way the structure was set up there. And today I can reflect on it much better. I can actually, after 30 years of being in the tech, and after more than 20-25 years of being a first line manager, I'm more comfortable saying that those were wrong things to do, but we didn't know any better. So I think I would say that as a manager, first of all, polish your own areas as much as possible. Don't be in a hurry to become a manager. You have 40 years of runway as a career. You will have enough opportunities to grow. If 1 year here, 1 year, 2 year does not make any difference. So that's number one. Number two, do not just be fixated on the idea that being technology, writing code is the only measure of somebody's net worth. It takes a village to raise a child. There are so many things other than the coding that go into the software, right? And if all you are doing is coding, then beware, chat GPTs and clouds of the world are coming after you. And what are you going to do when all your code writing is automated, right? So anyway, you have to search for a better answer to this question. Thirdly, as a manager, yes, and there are cultural differences also. A manager in the Western context has very small, I mean, has a very large personal distance. It's only stuck to professional kind of a thing there. But in many cases, the manager in India is also personally connected to the team members, because that is our social system. So we have to be aware of that, right? Because sometimes you are playing a brother or a sister, or even a father or a mother or a parent to them, right? Literally in a figurative sense, because you are dealing with very young people, very young, who are vulnerable. They are full of anxieties, they are full of questions, they are full of uncertainties. And your job as a manager is also to be a shoulder that they can cry upon. Your job as a manager is also, I would say, as a parent at times. I mean, I have had people cry in front of me and share their personal problems. Some cases deeply personal medical problems that they would not even share with their direct blood relatives, actually. So you have to offer a safe space. You have to be in a position to create the safe space where they feel comfortable that they can share things with you. They can literally unload and unpack the whole problem on you. And obviously, you have to be mature enough that you can process all that negativity and all the problems and everything else without it beginning to impact your mental health or your own way of thinking about it, right? Um, in a cross cultural sense, you have to develop that multifold ability. When I'm working with somebody, when I was working with the Chinese, I had to understand the cultural context. I had to understand the people context of what is really happening in China, how people are, how is the innovation happening, what are the market trends, and then be able to do that. So when I see somebody, I would do 2 hour meetings, and my Chinese engineers, my project managers on my team, they would not speak a single word at all. Now, I would expect some kind of a response from people, but they would not speak at all. Now, you cannot say that they are not participating. See, that's where the
Mhm.
difference is. The challenge for us is a lot of management literature has come from the research and practice from Western countries, where communication and over communication and speaking and disagreeing and talking is seen as a sign of engagement. It is seen as a sign of that you are in the conversation.
Mhm.
The Asian values are very different. Disagreement in our country or in China and other places often always is a sign of, like, disagreement is a sign of disrespect in many cases. And that is the reason why we do not disagree publicly. Now, if somebody is not saying anything, that does not mean that they agree with it. The reason they are not disagreeing openly is because they don't want to offend you. So, as a manager who doesn't fully understand these deep social meanings of silence, I think you have to develop that finesse. You have to develop that your ability to really get to the part of what is not spoken. It is mostly what is not spoken that is the problem, and what is spoken is something that has to go through multiple filters before you can really do that. So those guys in China, they would not speak because, and later on I found that the reason they would not speak is, one, obviously they were shy because they were not fluent with English, and second is they don't want to, their cultural grounding is such that they don't want to like make mistakes. Nobody, they don't want, and they feel that because they are not proficient in something, if they speak and if there is a mistake, people will make fun of them, so they don't want to do that. But the same guy in a one-on-one, or when they go back to their workstation, they would send emails with Queen's English or King's English, and I would have to refer to thesaurus to do that, because they would use a software to essentially write this thing. So the point I'm making is, if I would just go with a very blind observation and say, hey, in my vocabulary, being an engaged employee means somebody who's asking a lot of questions, raising the hand, or disagreeing, or generally very vocal about it, that thesis will fall flat when it comes to working with people in another culture where respect and order and social hierarchy and other things have been very firmly ingrained in them right from the childhood. Nothing is good or bad. I think that's the one thing that we have to understand. Every culture, I believe, is the survival operating system that people have developed in that particular region. And if you just take it out of the context and kind of airdrop it in another way, we all know that culture cannot be imported. Culture is not something that you go to a superstore and you can buy it from there. Culture is something that has to be organically, it has to organically evolve. So, and the reason why I call it as the survival operating system is because everybody has a different context. It is how a group of people come together and form their collective mental models of what is the best strategy for us to survive and thrive in the context that we are living in. And it is like a survival of the fittest, right? Just in this case, it is survival of the fittest mental model. Whatever is working gets doubled down. Whatever does not work gets discarded. And over a few iterations, that means over a few generations, you see the culture forming. And that's when we say, right, you should respect elders, right? And we especially come from a land where there's a lot of social contract about saying that, well, as kids, parents took care of you. You were not required to move out of the home when you turned 16, because the contract was that, hey, that is how the parents do. And we know so many stories in India, right? The parents are kind of selling their land, ancestral land, and house, putting it up on mortgage just so that they can send their kids to the college, right? That's a kind of a thing there. And the story is not complete, because when the kids reach the stage where they can make money, they realize that, hey, I have this sense of gratitude towards my parents who are now dependent on me, because they gave up their comfort when they did not have to do it, but they gave me their comfort to make me go through the college and give me the best life that I could. It is only natural that I take care of the same thing to them. That's how the cycle grows. That's how we have lived for 5,000 years. So culturally, I think you cannot expect that somebody should have very different thing, because like in US, for example, a lot of the kids would move out at the age of 16 and so on. And then there's a very different context. So I'm not saying that we have to be prejudiced against one over the other, but as a manager, we should have the cultural sensitivity to understand the people first. Because if you don't understand the people, no amount of process or systems or role or whatever role you are playing is ever going to work for you. Yes, in the short run, everybody can win. But in the long run, if you really want to succeed at building systems that will outlast you, I think that the understanding of people, the social systems, the cross-cultural knowledge is non-negotiable in my view. So at least those are that's one big area that I would say.
No, definitely, I think it is never enough, as you rightly said. I think that culture plays an important role, and also based on your experience, what you shared about that communication, right? Participation means talking and agreeing or making loud noise in the meetings, then even if they're not participating, the reason behind that, I think it's all important to understand. And also the cultural context and how it brings us together to work towards a common purpose. I definitely agree that it's interest. That's a good point to for a young manager or anybody to start observing and see how they can be a better leader. Next question
Sure.
I'm very curious is, how do you make decisions? Like, let me phrase it in a way, especially like big decisions, right? What is, do you go by gut feel or you go by analysis, or what is your mechanism?
Yeah, that's a very insightful question actually, because I've had a chance to completely redo my thinking around it during my last 20 years of journey as a leader. When I became leader for the first time formally in 2003, I went through the same kind of a vanities and vulnerabilities of a leader that any first time leader goes through. And let me explain that. When you become leader for the first time, you suddenly realize, and you have been promoted from within, you suddenly realize you are the smartest guy in the room, you know the best, and now you have to live up to that reputation. You cannot be seen as weak in front of your teams. You have to know all the answers. 20 years back, there was another kind of a burden on us. And I mean, 20 years back, most of us were men. Now, thankfully, we have more women in the workforce. But because of the historical and social biases we had, our leaders were mostly men. And there was an expectation, not a verbally expressed, but there was an implicit or implied expectation that as a leader, you were a father figure. You were also somebody who like looked after the flock, sort of a thing there. So now you suddenly are thrown in a situation where you cannot fall, and you have like dozens of eyes looking up and scanning your every movement, and you have to basically live up to the whole thing there. I remember I have gone through the same level of vulnerabilities, and many times you do not know the answer. You have, but you cannot say in front of others, "Hey, I don't know this," because the societal expectations of people around you, your troops, your team members, are kind of looking up to you, and they cannot expect that you do not know the answers, and you do not expect that they will give you the same level of respect if you do not tell them. That was 20 years back. Over a period of time, I have learned something. I think the most important lesson in leadership is to be able to say, I do not know this. And it took me time. It takes time for people. Most of the people do not even realize that they are actually a victim of that flawed mindset. But I think to me, the most courageous act is really to be able to say, hey guys, I do not know this. Does anyone know this thing? I think we need to do this thing. We'll have to solve it as a team. Why don't we do one thing? Those of you who know, come, let's talk about it. Or rest of you who are interested, come, let's do the whiteboarding. So I think in saying it is only less than 1 minute, but to cover that distance from the point where you say, I know everything, because that's the role that you have to play, to the time that you are able to come and say, hey, you come and step down in the trenches and say, I do not know this. I think that to me is the most difficult distance of a leader, the most difficult journey of a leader to do. It took me my own time, but I was glad I was able to do. And then the decision making, the next step is, because in the first, before leader, you had to take the decision. Sometimes you would go wrong, terribly wrong. But then not taking a decision or living with the dilemma was not an option. And neither was an option to go to the teams in the trenches and say, guys, what do you think about it? Because they would look up to you and say, come on, you are the leader. You are supposed to know the answers. In fact, we are looking up to you for the answer. And now you have this after kind of a leader who says, hey, guys, I do not know. I know you have worked on something. I know you have done something. Do any of you have an idea about how we should be looking at it? Well, that's a very, very radical way of decision making. So I developed over a period of time that my default mantra of making a decision was, when in doubt, go to the team. And that has really served me very well. My default 20 years back was not that. 20 years back was, when in doubt, I think you kind of rely on your own hunches. You maybe you have relied on your past experiences. There were no mentors. I mean, 20 years back, I didn't have too many people I knew who had been in a role like mine, whom I could speak to. Today, it's very easy to find more mentors. So I'm not saying that I would just make an arbitrary decision and just wing it. That is not what I mean. You would obviously apply, in fact, the responsibility is very high because people are expecting you to make a decision. Your boss is expecting you to make a decision. Your team is expecting you to make a decision. And if you fall, then obviously the cost is too high. So you try to do in a different way. You're not always right, but but then a lot of times, if you're lucky, your team and your manager has the understanding to support you. Today, I think we are more mature in our collective understanding. Your boss will understand if you say, "Hey, I have not done this particular thing, but give me a couple of days. Let me read up more about it. Let me talk to the people. Do you know somebody who has done something?" I think these are perfectly acceptable responses to being thrown in an unfamiliar situation, and going to the team and saying, "Guys, my manager is asking, he or she wants us to do this. We have not done this thing. I have not been involved in anything like that before, but I want to understand if anyone has any ideas about it. We'll have a brainstorming session. I want all of us to come, and I want us to decide it as a team." I mean, that's a kind of a culture if we are able to bring. That is a kind of leadership mindset if we are able to develop.
Yeah.
I think sky is the limit for that team. That's how I would see it.
Very nice, very nice. Maybe that in a nutshell, I think you can say that your journey from I know to I don't know. Maybe you can write a book also. But I think it is, yeah, it's
I think this is
interesting.
the most important journey for a leader. You summed it up very well. And that's the toughest journey. Most of the people never are able to make this journey from I know to I don't know kind of a thing. And I think the learning is complete only when you are able to go to this new destination, which is I don't
Yeah,
know.
beautiful. It's almost like a Zen, like, so I like this. It's nice. It's nice.
Sure, sure.
Now I wanted to little bit move towards your research, PhD, and also you took some time, right? It's not like you immediately after a few years you did. First of all, I'm curious, how did you even decide to do a PhD? Then I also want to know more about your topic and the research itself.
Yeah. Yeah. So, I mean, as I said, as I was earlier telling jokingly that in my family, from father, grandfather, everybody was a PhD. So there was a lot of unwritten pressure in terms of kind of living up to the family name or sort of doing something. But obviously, nobody ever said anything. But I always had that in the back of the mind that there was a teacher inside me. And I have been teaching part-time visiting faculty for last 10, 15 years. And my long-term interest is to go into teaching because I see myself as a natural teacher for two reasons. One is I've been teaching for 10, 15 years, so I know that I've been able to be reasonably successful in that. Second is, I think after being in the tech for 35 years, I feel that there is more value I can provide to the society by paying it forward and sharing it with the next generation. And I'm not just saying it for myself, but I think people like me, for example, we should be gracious enough to really say that, hey, it's not about being the career does not have to just continue another 5 years, 10 years on the same track that it has been for 35 years, but there is a higher value to the society. There is a bigger opportunity that we can do if we are able to switch the lanes a little bit and we are able to take the time to go and teach the future generation and share what we have learned with them, give them the experiences. If we did not get the right kind of support, we did not get the right kind of an exposure during our college days, the least thing we can do is really not to be the same, not to break the chain, and really not to be the same kind of a role model, but to become a better role model and go back and help it. And especially it's not just about going to the big cities kind of a thing. Go to where we all came from. We all came from small towns. We all owe a lot of success to the people around us. If we keep doing the system where the best of the talent just keeps moving from a village to a town to a tier B town, and a tier B town to the Bangalore's and the Hyderabad's of the world, and then from there we go other tech hubs of the world, and nobody ever takes that wisdom back to those small villages and towns. I don't think it is fair to say that we are not developing, and when are we going to see ourselves as a developed nation, especially talk in terms of India, because we have never made the efforts to actually bring that knowledge back to the grassroots. So I feel more and more as I age and as I see, I see that I think unless we have a sense of responsibility, a sense of obligation, that whatever I have learned is because there were people to support me, the system to support me, and if I do not do the same kind of a thing, I think it is unfair, because then I'm just skimming the milk, but I'm not really leaving the system enriched. So that is really driving me. And that is what started to drive me for my journey for PhD, because I said, hey, in if I really want to take it seriously, I will need to have a PhD degree, because otherwise the academic world, I need to qualify to that standard, as simple as that. I cannot simply say that because I have spent time in the industry, people will give me a red carpet welcome. So I went through that. I went through the school of hard knocks. I decided that the easiest way of getting the PhD was the hardest way of actually earning. So I spent 5 years in doing it, because I wanted to really do it. Here is how I put it. I'm not doing my PhD to get my first job, and neither it is for my last job. I'm doing it because I'm going to put my name on it. It is not just putting a doctor in front of your name, but it is putting my name on some idea. And if I'm not happy with that, if I'm not convinced that that is what I would like to do, forget about being remembered for 200 years. Nobody's remembered for 200 years. I would be happy if it can if it can find its way in five people trying to use my ideas. But if I expect that five people will use my ideas, I don't want to be in a situation where people come back tomorrow and say, that was a second class idea. I don't think there was any originality in it. Why we wasted our time? So for me, the it was driven by the desire that I would like to be satisfied. If I were to be consuming my own output, would I be happy with that? So that was really what drove me to go through the whole process of doing my PhD. And then, yeah, in 2024, late 2024, I completed it. And then last year, I was basically working on a book which I wanted to distill a lot of my knowledge and learnings through my process, so that it could be of use to those who are interested in that.
Very nice. In fact, I was not surprised when you enrolled into PhD, but I also knew that the outcome will all benefit from that. Uh, and also, your book is coming up, right? Tell me
Yes.
more about your research and the book, and when it is due, but also some ideas from that which are interesting for us to look
Correct.
forward
Yeah.
to.
Sure, sure. Yeah, that's my favorite topic. So thanks for asking me on that. So my book, my research question was, I started seeing, I got interest in knowledge management and complex systems, and then I found that maybe my PhD topic was more on the artificial intelligence. And this was in 192021, sorry, 2020, kind of a time frame. And it was driven from observation again, that while AI was advancing, and this is before generative AI and chat GPT and everything else, it was limited in pockets, and a lot of AI data, the anecdotal industry data, was pointing towards a lot of failures. In fact, almost 80 to 85%, or in some cases even 90% of the pilots were failing in production. And the more I read about it, the more the data seemed to be repeating, the patterns were repeating, that a lot of these pilots, a lot of these experiments were working fine within the lab, within a very, what I call as a very sharply defined or a bounded problem. But the moment we took it out in the real world, the moment we started implementing them in production, most of them were failing. And I could not understand it, because to me, it was a technology change management problem, not a technology or a core technical problem, but a technology change management problem. And that has been around for 30, 40 years, if not more. So, and we have been doing large systems technology, whether ERP systems or HR systems and so on and so forth. Well, yes, there are problems of delays in software. We know there are software is not perfect, but failures of 80-90% were unheard of in that world. So I started to do research in that. And I found that while there were research frameworks on technology adoption, most of them were very outdated. They had been written in 1980s and 90s and in early 2000s, and they were not even written for AI-based software. They were written for the deterministic software, the software that behaves like a finite state machine, but not for the software that's like a non-deterministic stochastic software, so like AI. And then they were focused on, they had their own limitations, which I later on, when I did the systematic literature review, I found that there were more challenges, structural challenges in them. So that was my motivation, where I said, why there is no proper framework or theory that can explain the kind of failures that we are seeing, the kind of systemic and rampant failures that we are seeing in the field with AI. And when I started doing it, I was doing on AI. And then in 2022 November, as we know, when ChatGPT was announced, it changed the whole thing. It was like such a seismic event that suddenly within 6 months, everybody began to talk about generative AI. So I pivoted to generative AI because I was seeing same kind of patterns, even generative AI, even though it was only 6 months old, the patterns were beginning to recur. And with the agentic AI, I'm seeing the same kind of patterns once again. So the problem really became was, what are the success factors of generative AI adoptions in enterprises? What are we call them as the antecedents or the preconditions? What are the moderators or the facilitators? And what are the consequences or the outcomes of a successful generative AI adoption? And when I completed my research and I did my analysis, I found that there are a lot of failure patterns that were recurring into the field. I started calling these failure modes or failure patterns as cognitive chasms. And that cognitive chasm was basically, it became the main central pillar of my research. And I called that as theory of cognitive chasms, which essentially describes what are the leading causes behind these failure modes. And then basically my book talks more about in detail in terms of what can a practitioner do in order to mitigate the risk or the impact of some of these failure modes. So the whole idea there was, how do we make sure that we are not sinking more money into the generative AI, especially in enterprises, but can we improve the chances? Can we improve the success ratio of our generative AI investments?
Very nice. Good. Like how it can impact different areas.
So my research was around generative AI because that is what I chose. Now, when we create a research framework or a theory, it is basically what we call as a substantive theory, which means it was essentially a substantive theory to describe what happens in the generative AI field. A natural question comes is, okay, is your theory usable beyond generative AI? Like, is it a normative theory? Can you can you describe how metaverse can your theory be used to describe the adoption patterns of metaverse? Can it be used to describe adoption patterns of 3D printing or anything else, at least in the technology domain? Tomorrow, can it be used to potentially even describe, like, is there a meta framework which is away from generative AI? Would you be in a position to even replicate it or generalize it for, let us say, quantum computing, for example? And in many cases, I was able to find that some of those learnings, the underpinnings of the theory of cognitive chasm, do have an applicability beyond generative AI. Because I was able to establish some kind of a logical or a conceptual alignment, that if you see, for example, metaverse, right? It came, there was a lot of buzz around the whole thing, and people felt everything is meta. I mean, you had company Facebook even change the name to Meta, right? Because there was so much of promise of Meta. But then, when was the last time we heard of metaverse? When was the last time we heard of Web3? When was the last time we heard of NFT? blockchain still continues on and off, but then the initial euphoria that we had 6 7 years back around blockchain doesn't have that. Crypto, it continues in cycles, for example, but it doesn't have that kind of a thing. And outside the tech also, if you think about it, you have so many grand projects that have been taken up on fancy ideas. Like we saw this whole hyperloop project, right? And nobody has even spoken about hyperloop in the last 3 4 years now. There was this big project in the Middle East, right? I think they called it the line or something, which was
Mhm.
like they were building this 10 mile long living structure in one dimension, right? So instead of a building or a community in the middle of a desert, they have like 10 mile or some such crazy thing. Somewhere I read 100 mile, I don't know what it was, that they were to build a self-contained where communities and you will have everybody is living in one dimension basically, because outside is all desert, so you are living inside. And I believe it is kind of delayed and shelved or reimagined and so on and so forth. So what I was beginning to see that there are a lot of these fancy ideas that people come up with, um, and they appear nice on paper because they are like very fancy, and there's a lot of initial buzz around that, and there's a lot of hype and media hype and financial investor hype and so on. But then, like the Gartner hype curve, they kind of go down when people realize that, hey, this is a fancy idea, but like there's no real application out of the whole thing, and nobody is going to make any money out of it. I find that my theory has a little more structure in terms of the causal framework. We can use it to really describe what kind of a causal framework may be telling. And when I say causal, it is like if X then Y kind of a thing. So I can look at Y, but I'm able to now understand the X of that. Like what if X then Y, rather than saying that technology in a very generic way and say, oh, metaverse was too ahead of its time or NFT was more hype value or something like that. We can probably answer that in a little more scientific or a logical language and say, this is the reason why we saw this kind of a failure. And by the way, this kind of cognitive chasm describes it more accurately what really happened there out of the four cognitive chasms. So I believe that there is a value in my work beyond the generative AI alone, and it only time will tell. Everybody who builds a theory cannot be immediately proven. But I hope there is more adoption of the ideas. It's not purely my creation. Obviously, I've created that, but I have learned from everyone from the field, from the research, and from the practice. And I have basically given a new shape to the ideas. So I hope that more people, when they examine it, when they put it to pressure test, they will be in a position to see whether these ideas are helping them or not. And that is something that I'm very keen to learn as my book goes out in a few months from now.
Right. Means basically like anyone who is exploring or including individuals or organizations which are exploring into say, adopting or
Yeah,
exploring generative AI, they can consider, read, understand these theories, and then see how it practically applies to their situation and see is it whether it's
correct.
working or not like that. That's
Yeah,
that's
I'll
that's
keep my fingers crossed for that.
good, good. That's a good this thing. Is there anything else you wanted to share in this podcast which we not covered?
No, I think it's been wonderful, Raghav, talking to you. Obviously, you raised very interesting, and some of them I had not even thought or spoken about in years and decades. And it was a good way for me to go back the memory lane and really remember all those things. I think we are all living in a very interesting time where the changes are happening. And the good thing about the future is that the future is often the history repeated. And a lot of times, people who are not paying attention to the history, they find and they are surprised when some things happen in the future. I think the more things change, the more I find answers going back in time, learning from, like, for example, what we are seeing with the whole issue of potential job losses with AI and everything else. A lot of people who have not read the history will find the value of how the first industrial revolution, when it started in England, and when the whole looms were brought in Manchester and other places, how the whole Luddism got created, what was Luddism all about. A lot of times it was misinterpreted, and why today's people who are opposing the indiscriminate use of technology without any safeguards, they are not just Luddites, they are not people who are irrational people. They are worried about the future. When you see this whole malt book kind of things happening, apparently the agents coming together, AI agents, and building their own sort of social network of sorts. I think to me, a lot of those questions should at least wake us up, if not put us on a notice, because we are going to build the tools that will decide how the society will use them in the future. And in a lot of ways, past generations have gone through some of these things themselves. We may have not read about them, or we may have forgotten about them, but I think it's important to do that. And the last thing I would say is that in the middle of it all, building all the technology and doing all that stuff, I think we are missing that the fundamental role of technology is for the human progress. It is for the human betterment. So if there is any technology, if there is anything that's being developed which makes humans as the second class citizens of the equation, I think we have got the wrong priorities. It's perfectly fine to make technological progress, to develop new ideas and products and what have you. But I think we need to understand that without the human condition, without the human experiences, without the human role, all of it collapses. People talk about, for example, chat GPTs of the world doing the content creation and all, but the humans were the first creators of that knowledge which has been used for pre-training. And if because of the technology the authors are going to go out of business, the musicians are going to go out of business, if artists are going to go out of the business, if script writers and songwriters and movie makers and people who create knowledge in the first place are going to go out of business, because the economics of generative AI makes it so easy for people to generate what appears to be a new content by the push of a button, I think we are grossly and sadly mistaken about the role of human beings in the future. And the only thing I would say is that it's almost very tempting for us not to consider the role of the humans, because it's a mad rush for technology. It's like a gold rush on. But I think I believe that the forget about the companies and the industries. I'm more worried about the societies that will survive in the long run. The societies that really shortchange the role of human beings are standing at a big risk to essentially killing the golden goose that lay the golden eggs, kind of a thing. So I would say, I think a lot of those things require more, they don't require expertise because nobody is an expert in that, but I think they require more debate. They require more discussion. They require more disagreement. They require more reading by all of us at a fundamental level. And most of all, I will probably close it with the first thing that I started out in the when we started conversing, that if they are not really curious about things, if they are not observing about things, if they are not asking the questions about it, and if they are not really challenging the established mental models, I don't think any of that is going to be possible. So, for me personally, it is something that I have lived through the whole life, which I strongly believe in. And I feel very strongly that if we are not doing it, we are probably not in the right discipline. We are just living in ignorance, and we are just living with a naive assumption that everything is going to be good for us. We shouldn't really have to worry about it. I think the stakes are very high. All of us have a skin in the game. All of us need to be involved in questioning and helping each other. And I know that no one question is going to change the reality. But if all of us are really coming together and thinking about it and questioning it, hopefully we will be able to shape the future the way we want it to be, rather than the way it turns out to be. So those are some of the things that I would say, as kind of wrapping up my thoughts on this, Raghav.
Good, good. I also agree. Like, we should not be fearful, but at least thoughtful. Like, we should ask, we should think, we should, if we don't know, maybe discuss with people and engage in that debate and all.
Correct.
Just to
Yeah.
wrap up, I thought maybe we'll have some, let's end with some light noted
Okay.
questions. Just a quick, your preferences, like tea or coffee? You're
Tea
a
in the
tea person?
morning, coffee in the day.
Okay, good. Morning person or late nights?
So more of a morning person. I mean, I get up morning because I like the whole um, no noisy, no noise, nothing noise free kind of an environment because you can do a lot of reading and catching up on things. But yeah, so that's the preference for the morning.
And what kind of a music, like classical or rock or pop?
Anything that was written until 1960s, maybe a little bit of 1970s. After that, there was no music. It's only noise.
Nice.
Any language, I would say.
Good. And if at all, if you get a time on a free day, how would you like to spend? Like, how do you spend your free time?
You would mostly find me reading. So I do a lot of reading. I read 100 books a year or more. So that's something. If I have a nice book or an ebook, that's all I need.
Awesome. And if you read so many books, right? I wanted to ask one, but I think one will be difficult. Maybe a couple of books which you recommend or which you really stayed with you, which really influenced you.
Yeah. So many books are there. Some offer a lot of insight. Often, I would say, for example, one of the books that had a very interesting perspective was the Giant Orbiting Hairball by Gordon McKenzie. And the Giant Orbiting Hairball is really Gordon McKenzie, who was a creative director at Hallmark. Kind of his book before he passed away of how to he originally wrote it like, how do you survive in an organization if you have a creative urges where the organization does not really always offer you the opportunity to use them, but expects you to comply with them. And I think it's a great book for people who have a lot of personal agency, that they
Mm.
are very creative, they like to be independent, they like to be autonomous, they don't like rules and compliance, but they still have to work in an organization which where we all know 60, 70, 80% of the times the work is around compliance and methods and systems and processes. Not everybody is lucky to always be able to do that. So that's one book I like because it is such a lovely reading there. Another book, I would say, one of the books that has had a lot of impact is Man's Search for a Meaning by Viktor Frankl, which, as we know, right? I mean, he survived through the Holocaust, and I'm personally that genre of books. It obviously it gives goosebumps of how human nature can be and how people went through mindless pain and torture and deaths, but it also gives a lot of inspiration of the people who survived. What did they do? And even in the worst of the times, how did they manage to get the best out of them and keep sanity alive and come back with a lot of positivity? I think that's, to me, it offers a hope for the mankind. And the last genre of books I would say where a lot of books that have provided me a lot of ideas were actually during the 50s and 60s. There was this whole group of social psychologists who basically did a lot of research in the US universities, which, if you think about it, today it would be actually banned. It would be not unethical, but illegal to even do those kind of things. So, for example, the work by the Stanford professor Philip Zimbardo on the whole prison experiment, the Stanford prison experiment, where he took the volunteers, half of them he made them prisoners, and half of them were prison guards. And he ran the experiment and he observed the human behavior of what happens when the only thing that changes is when you tell the people, hey, you are a prisoner and you are a prison guard, their entire behavior changes. Or, for example, the whole Stanley Milgram's experiments of the obedience study of how human behavior is so fickle that if we meet somebody in authority, we just end up blindly agreeing with everything they say, even if it is we don't personally subscribe to those value systems there. So I think these are the frailties of human nature that they explored, and some of their methods, because like in the obedience study, Stanley Milgram, he would basically like supposedly apply electric shock if you gave a wrong answer, going all the way up to 450 volts, which obviously later on we came to know it was a staged actor. But even then, the way these were done, they give you goosebumps. And I've watched even the movies nowadays. The movies have come on the Experimenter and some of this stuff. I get so much of ideas and inspiration by just as a curious, not a like the onlooker and the observer and the questioner around it and say, hey, so what is it that we can learn? What are some of the things that stand out as the human nature and things like that? So those are the kind of things that really inspire me. And then yes, there are other material on complex systems and biomimicry and the nature which really give me so many new ideas. But it's a very wide list, obviously.
Yeah, it is not a, it can have another podcast on all the books itself, maybe. But it
Sure.
was wonderful talking to you, and it's always pleasure talking to you. But this was, we made time to sit and run through the whole journey. Really inspiring, lot of nuggets. Maybe I'll also make some notes on that. Thank you for your time. And definitely next time when I meet and I'm in Bangalore, I'll definitely meet. Maybe if you're traveling from your US to Bangalore, maybe you can do a stopover at London and can definitely catch up. Thank you for your time.
Absolutely, Raghav. And likewise, I absolutely always a pleasure talking to you. And thanks for inviting me for this opportunity. And I think we had a wonderful conversation on like very freewheeling discussion on so many topics, very close to my heart, obviously. Thanks for the opportunity. And yeah, I would look forward to listening to the podcast soon
Thank you.
and meeting you in person as well.
Thank you. Thank you. Thanks a lot.
Okay, thanks a lot.